great pleasure to be here. My first visit to Galway, I have to confess, although I'm a reasonably frequent visitor to various parts of Ireland. I've been sitting in at the back throughout the day, actually, listening to the talks. Very, very interesting stuff. I'm going to take, I think, a very different angle on a lot of the same issues, because many of you are concerned with innovation at the level of the Irish economy, as well as some sort of constituent parts of it. I'm a strategy professor, and my primary concern is to figure out how things work from the point of view of the person who leads the organisation, whether that's a subsidiary company or whether that's a multinational company or whatever it is. So a lot of what I want to say is an attempt to, I think, to sort of contextualise these things in terms of the decisions and choices that people make on a day-to-day basis. I've got a sort of a smorgasbord of materials for you. I didn't know enough about the interests of the people in the room, so I thought I would pick up on actually 4 or 5 different papers that I've written over the years. Some of them more theoretical, some of them more applied. So we call this talk kind of from theory to practice, on the basis that it's all academic research based, but it's all got a point of view, I think, on the practical sort of context and meaning of the world. I think, the context today doesn't need justifying. I mean, obviously we're in the middle of the worst recession in living memory. Business people have lost credibility there, are less respected, I think, today than they have been for many years. Not universally, certainly the bankers foremost amongst them. And of course, and I put Ireland there, but I think many countries are saying to themselves, have we got our economic model quite right? And a lot of the comments, particularly this morning, of course, were about trying to say, is the current innovation strategy for Ireland as a country correct? I want to talk about innovation in terms of the role that it plays in recovery. A lot of people will ask me, surely when times are tough, we should be cutting back on innovation spending. Surely, as we cut our investments across the board, innovation has to go. And of course, the right answer, as well as the answer that one tends to give, is that one has to avoid cutting one's lifeblood, cutting one's long-term investment in innovation. But there are also smart ways of ensuring that you make cuts in the right sort of places. And this is my kind of stock answer to that question. I've got three stock answers, all of which say we can be smarter about how we invest in innovation if we are a company. First of all, to remind ourselves that innovation isn't just new technologies and new products. This has been alluded to this morning, but I'm going to talk a little bit about the broader spectrum of ways that we can define innovation. Don't try to do it all yourself. That leads naturally to the simple open innovation paradigm. I know Henry Chesber's coming here and come to Ireland in a few months to talk about this. I'm going to give you my own thoughts on this. And a few thoughts on what you might call the experimental approach that I think is sort of systemic to any innovation strategy. That's the first part of the talk, and then I'm going to kind of get into my historical interest in subsidiary strategy, the strategy of foreign-owned subsidiaries in a country like Ireland. I just mention this now because I think it's important. I mean, wherever in the world I go, Australia, Canada, Scotland, Sweden, I've given talks about how do you manage your foreign-owned sector, and everyone comes back to Ireland, whether you think Ireland is doing a great job right now or not. Ireland continues to be the kind of role model of a country that has got its foreign-owned strategy right, if you like, its management of foreign direct investment. Now, I realise that there are changes afoot, but everything I see convinces me that things are still heading in the right direction. So that's just a forewarning. So, 3 strategies in a if you like, that work for innovation in a recession. First of all, let's remind ourselves that when we say innovation, we don't just mean new technologies and new products. This is a survey IBM did a couple of years back. They asked chief executives about sort of the emphasis on product service innovation, on operational innovation, and on business model innovation. Frankly, they missed a few categories. The point of this slide is just to say that business model innovation is out there, generally gets recognised as a category, but is less apparently important to many, or less easily done perhaps than operational or product innovation. Here's a little quiz for you, a rhetorical question. This is now 4-year-old data. Which companies spend the most on R&D? Which companies in 2005 spent the most money on R&D? Well, there's two very large car companies, one of which is technically bankrupt, General Motors, another which is limping along, will almost certainly survive, but, you know, these are the companies that spend more money than any other company. Nowadays, the pharmaceutical companies tend to outspend the car companies. And yet, as we know, you know, their track record in delivering effective outputs from that innovation expenditure is dismal, frankly. In fact, studies have proven there's no statistically meaningful correlation, if you like, between R&D spending and financial performance. Just why is that? I mean, there's a couple of reasons for that. I mean, let me just give you the two main reasons that you're likely to encounter. One of the reasons, of course, is that we're not measuring the right thing. That R&D spending is a very narrow measure. This, of course, is my point for this section. We spend money on R&D as we define R&D. We actually spend an awful lot of money on other things, which is actually innovation related. So the banks technically were spending hardly any money on R&D, but they were doing an awful lot of innovation, frankly, far too much innovation, if you see what I mean. So partly it's a measurement problem. The measure of R&D is a problem, but there's also a massive kind of rhetoric reality gap, if you see what I mean. You know, you see these companies who talk about innovation and forward, it's the guiding compass for everything they do. The fact is that by saying that you want to do innovation and actually delivering effective innovation outputs, there's a massive gap. There's an awful lot of things you have to do in terms of processes and people and measures and incentives in between to translate that input into meaningful output. And of course it's attractive to measure inputs, but the reality is that those inputs can be easily squandered, and there's lots of evidence out there that they are squandered. So one of the points I want to continue to come back to, and I'll pick up on it right at the end, is that, you know, there's this gap between innovation as a concept and entrepreneurship, and I think, you know, James asked the question on that earlier. Innovation is sort of the disembodied process by which we turn ideas into commercial outputs. Okay? You know, it's idea plus commercialization equals innovation. Entrepreneurship is a behavior, it is a human trait, if you like. And indeed, we cannot imagine certain innovators, you know, the pharmaceutical scientists sitting in his or her lab. They are innovators, they are trying to create commercial outputs, but they're not entrepreneurs. And for me, in fact, as we get into a discussion about innovation, I very quickly gravitate towards entrepreneurship as the driving force behind innovation. You can have innovation without entrepreneurship, but frankly, if I had to choose one or the other as the sort of the focus, you know, if I wanted to be a minister of innovation or a minister of entrepreneurship, I would actually choose to be a minister for entrepreneurship, because for me that's actually the more important sort of underlying capacity that you're trying to create. So I have in mind a sort of, is it a hierarchy or is it a spectrum? It doesn't really matter. The point is this, that we do tend to get bogged down in classic, basic forms of innovation. Operational innovation, that's a 6 sigma diagram there. Technology innovation, product or service innovation. These are identifiable, but they're also, you know, patenting aside, they're also relatively easy to copy. What has always fascinated me, at least for the last 5 or 10 years or so, is these kind of higher order forms of innovation, business model innovation, management model innovation. My hunch is, and I can't prove this in any sort of statistical sense, but my hunch is that to the extent that an organization is able to develop some of these higher order forms of innovation, they actually offer the potential for competitive advantage. By the same nature, it's less likely that you're going to be successful in developing them, but my argument would always be that you should always be shooting for some of these more systemic forms of innovation. Let me take the two in turn, business model innovation, management model innovation. Business model innovation, remind yourself, if you like, of the classic kind of life cycle model of the computer industry. You recognize this. I mean, this is kind of standard stuff that any business school will teach. We start out with technology innovation as a source of advantage at the start of an industry. Gradually, the product innovation, the creation of products that people want to buy becomes important. Process innovation kind of kicks in as the product reaches some sort of mass market or maturity. And then there's various kind of exit strategies that can play at the end of the game. Where's business model innovation in there? Well, it turns out it's across the whole thing. If you just, I'll just pull up the whole set of examples. You know, this is just 4 that I quickly plucked out just from general knowledge of the industry. Apple Mac, the original Apple Mac, was this integrated model, deliberately kind of flying in the face of the kind of the IBM dominance at that point in time. You all know about Dell and Dell's direct selling model. That was a business model innovation because it was basically selling the classic thing in a slightly different way. Of course, in the latter stages of the industry, we see the growth of the whole IT services and support industry. Apple has reinvented that industry since. My point is a simple one. You know, we have this very simple kind of life cycle model, and we kind of forget the fact that the business model innovation can be overlaid on top of that. So there's always scope there. Let me briefly touch on management model innovation, because that's really the whole subject of my talk tomorrow, is on management model innovation. What do I mean by management model innovation? I mean a new way of working internally. Management model, the way that the choices that you make about how you allocate resources, the choices you make about decisions and incentives, all of these, if you like, are things that you do, things that companies do, which can be reinvented. There's no saying that the way that we organise and structure and allocate resources is as good as it gets. The classic way of proving this point, if you like, just to make the point, is the car industry. You know, how can we best explain the long-term successes and failures of companies in the car industry? Well, you can look at the cars that they've made, we can look at the leaders. I'd like to look at the management innovations that have enabled that industry to evolve over generations. You know, Ford's greatest invention was the production line. Okay? They actually stole the idea from the local abattoirs, it turns out, the sort of the disassembly line that Henry Ford took that idea. He was the first person to kind of really commercialize, as it were, automate that process. It gave him competitive advantage for 20 years. Alfred P. Sloan, you know, the guy who really took General Motors to the status of global leader, he was the guy, of course, who invented, among other things, the decentralized, professional, bureaucratic company. He's got an awful lot to answer for, by the way. And not only was he the originator of the big industrial structures that we see today, the kind of legacy of what he created is actually the seeds of GM's demise today. Because they could never rid themselves of that kind of adherence to controls and professional formal standards. And to some degree, that legacy was what has made it very difficult for them to change. And then, of course, the final era is the one that you all know the story, the total quality, if you like, that was led by Toyota and to some degree by Honda. There's a fascinating story here, if I can just take 2 minutes. I was working with a group of executives from Ford in London, and over drinks after dinner, we had a little conversation about Ford's. They said they'd just done their 17th annual benchmarking project with Toyota. Their 17th, okay? And we said, okay, that's interesting. You know, what did you learn on the 17th benchmarking activity that you didn't learn on the previous 16th? So this was every year for 17 years they've been benchmarking Toyota's practices and Toyota's quality standards and Toyota's productivity against their own productivity. And the answer, again, over a pint of beer, if you like, was actually quite instructive. They said, look, for the first 5 years, frankly, when we saw the data coming back from Toyota about their quality standards, their productivity levels, we just didn't believe it. We just said, how can they be, you know, an order of magnitude higher quality than we are? So we just threw out the data. But the data kept on coming back. And then they started saying to themselves, well, perhaps there's something mysteriously kind of Japanese about it. You know, Japanese companies. You remember this era? This was the era of, you know, trying to figure out quality circles and the company songs and the 200-year plans and all this sort of stuff. We had this sort of mystique of Japanese management was somewhat different. But of course the trouble is that what happened is Japanese companies came to America and then they came to Europe and they created their own transplant factories and they were as high quality using British and Irish and American workers as the plants in Japan. So the Ford guys had to reject their second hypothesis, which was that somehow Japanese management was just different. And they said they finally figured out that the reason that Toyota was still vastly superior to them after years of trying to catch up was that Toyota had started from a different set of management principles. Very simple point. You know, their basic principle was that you can get a positive return on investment on the problem-solving skills of the employees. In other words, if we invest in our people and we give them the skills to actually take quality seriously, we give them the power to stop the production line, we will get a return on that investment. And you know, in some ways that's an old story, kind of between the kind of Tayloristic approach and the empowerment and quality approach. But it's really quite interesting that even 20 years on, 30 years on, you know, most Western automobile companies are still trying to catch up with Toyota. Okay, let me move on, because I've got a lot of ground to cover. That's really just a sort of an advertisement for tomorrow morning, the idea that we can innovate our management systems. Let me talk a little bit about open innovation, because as I said, my second observation to any company that says, what can we do in a downturn, is don't try to do it all yourself. There's lots of networks out there. You've heard of InterTrade. InterTrade is one of these networks where if you've got a technical problem, you sort of submit it to InterTrade, and they shoot it out to their, you know, depending on the nature of the problem, 160,000 plus people around the world. And they come back, I've seen this happen, they come back with flights of suggestions. This is open innovation at work. Top Coders, an American software company with 170,000 software developers, none of whom were employees, they were all just part of the community. And, yes, please. You all know the story. Open innovation is out there. It's been around for a decade now. I have some questions and I have some concerns, and I think it's important to take a kind of critical look at open innovation. See when is it actually optimal to adopt an open innovation strategy? When should we be opening up our activities? When should we be opening up our sources? And I think we have a phenomenon in search of a theory, if you like. And for those academics in the room who are interested in open innovation, and I've certainly written a little bit in this area, I worry that we haven't really nailed the theory here. I think we've got to answer three questions, and I think we're actually going to answer the first one better than the others. The first is almost like an economic geography question, about where is the necessary knowledge. You know, it sits in clusters, it sits in hotspots. How do we tap into that? I think we've got a reasonable answer to that question. I think we've got a half-decent answer to this question in terms of the modes of governance. What do I mean by that? Do we create an alliance? Do we create a corporate venturing unit? Do we create a spin-out unit? These are all mechanisms or modes of governance for accessing, in both directions, if you like, knowledge that goes beyond our formal boundaries. And then I think the third one is the most problematic of a lot, largely because the people who can answer it are not actually the sort of people who are interested in open innovation, which is this issue about the behaviours or the attitudes that we as individuals have towards sharing. And of course there's a lot of reciprocation involved in these sort of activities. And I think a proper theory of open innovation needs to tackle all three of these questions. And as I say, I don't believe it's done that yet. I mean, I think in terms of this chart as a way of making sense of these three dimensions. On the left-hand side, we have the classic kind of closed model of innovation, which we all recognise. This is the old model of an IBM or a Philips or even an Apple. And then on the right-hand side, we have, you know, open source software, if you like, a Linux-type collaborative as the archetype of fully open innovation, where we have dispersed knowledge, we have no controlling entity. Not to say that there's no hierarchical relation between, you know, the Linux sort of head honchos and the people developing the code. There is, but the intellectual property is not in any way controlled by a small group. And there is trust, and there is reciprocity in those relationships. Now, for me, the fascinating part of the story is this middle block. It's kind of left blank for good reason. It's difficult to completely resolve in your mind how these pieces fit together, what the midpoint between distrust and trust is, and indeed how the sort of elements of the model fit together. I'm going to give you just a couple of examples which I think help to illustrate my concern, and then I'll show you the result of my research. You know, I did a little case study recently of Procter & Gamble's very famous Connect and Develop process. Many of you will know this. This is one of these classic approaches to innovation whereby they develop a bit like in a centre, their network of scientists around the world to whom they can call on when they've got technical issues they want to establish. And of course they've had a lot of fanfare about it. This chap, Larry Houston, has been banging the drum of open innovation. They've managed to create sort of numbers which make it look promising, but at the same time I'm incredibly sceptical, actually. I'm not trying to say Dr. McGann was not doing a good job. If you ask me to wager on this, in 5 or 10 years' time, will Connect and Develop be an integral part of Procter & Gamble strategy? I would actually doubt that. I can't prove that. It's just a hunch, and the hunch is because of the sort of the tension that lies between doing things yourself and doing things on the outside. And just another example, IBM. Some of you will call it an innovation jam. IBM put on. A jam is, in their vernacular, is an online collaborative brainstorm. So rather than getting 50 people into a room, they say, why don't we use the entire network of IBM, using our highly secure, highly sort of popular intranet, and have a brainstorming event with hundreds of thousands of people. And they tried this with, they tried this with their values. They did what they called the Values Jam, whereby they got people to comment on IBM's core values back in 2003. Enormously successful. They tried it again with a so-called Innovation Jam. And the idea of this Innovation Jam was, we're going to put out there a bunch of technologies, a bunch of ideas, a bunch of things that we're working on. And we're going to get the entire IBM population and most of our suppliers and our customers and so forth. And because I'm a friend of a guy who works there, I got access to this thing as well myself. And the idea is everybody collaborates and contributes their ideas in order to create something bigger and better. Now, it's a beautiful model, if you like, and it was a success, but only from partial success. Here's a quote from the guy behind it. He says, "We are betting there's enough expertise in IBM that we can apply these insights for commercial ends ahead of our competitors. We're living in an era of innovation. We're betting with innovations like Innovation Jam that we can stay ahead of the tsunami of commoditization in our industry. It's inherent in this approach that we don't know where it will take you." What they discovered was that it was quite good at closing. The process was quite good for closing down certain ideas. It was quite good for getting feedback on existing ideas. It was actually completely terrible at coming up with genuine new insights. And I think as they've gone through the process of making sense of this, they're starting to realise that there are certain types of activities that work with this sort of methodology and other types that do not. I mean, don't get me wrong, they've managed to launch a number of initiatives and trouble this, but it's not completely clear how much of the open innovation process they followed led to them. So, I've got some questions, I've got some concerns. I think these hybrid models, sometimes the parts of the system sit uneasily with others. You know, open innovation is a leap of faith, and I really worry about the idea that you can create, if you like, new ideas by tapping into the so-called wisdom of the crowds. Just a quick insight from an academic study I did a few years ago. It's still a working paper. This used the so-called Community Innovation Survey. Some of you will know the Community Innovation Survey. And it looked at innovation outputs as a function of two attributes: the external knowledge, access to various entities out there, which several people today have been talking about, and the extent to which we are able to protect our knowledge through either formal or strategic means. Now, both of these two variables have actually a curvilinear relationship, an inverted U-shaped relationship with innovation. They both have value, but there are limits to that value. The key point here is that, which was that the knowledge protection mechanism also acts, if you like, as a suppressor, a negative impact on the relationship between external knowledge source and innovation. Now think about what I mean by that for a second. What we're saying here is that these two activities are in conflict. It's at one level, very simple finding. But an organisation that on the one hand says we want to share with all our partner countries, while at the same time saying we're going to protect our assets very closely, they're sending a very mixed message. This is what I mean about the tension inherent in open innovation strategy. And this is big sample stuff, okay? So we can't draw any very strong inferences about company strategy. But it does tell us that, at very least, you've got to manage that tension between, as it were, sharing on the one hand and protecting on the other. Because human behaviour says, if you're not going to share with me, I'm not going to share with you, if you see what I mean. So, I've got some thoughts on open innovation, as I've said, and I think there's a message for researchers as well as a message for business people in terms of how it works. And I just urge you, perhaps you've already got to this point, but I urge you to take a fairly sort of sceptical approach to open innovation, because there's always a risk with these sort of trends that they take us too far down a track that we don't want to go down. My third observation about how to innovate in tough times is about what you might call an experimental approach. And this is a very basic logic here, but I want to just elaborate on it. The basic logic is, yes, we can bet the farm on a big project. Motorola invested in Iridium a few years back. You'll remember this. I forget whether this was $6 or $7 billion of money that ultimately they threw down the drain because they built this network of satellite-based mobile phones, which seemed like a good idea at the time. You could go on Mount Everest and you can make a call. But the fact is, there's not actually that many people who sitting on Mount Everest or sitting in the middle of the Sahara Desert who actually want to make a call. The people who want to make the call tend to be the ones in towns, and those are pretty well served by the conventional, or at that time, the technology which was being rolled out. So let's not sort of debrief where Iridium went wrong. My point is, Iridium was a bet the farm type bet. And a lot of companies get into this mindset that if you're going to do something, you've got to do it big. And of course, the fact is that innovation can also be incredibly modest, but also radical. These are old examples, but it's just worth. Whoever thought that you could innovate lettuce? Well, it turns out you can. You can get far greater margins from bagged lettuce than you can by selling it whole. And entire shelves of the supermarket today are filled with these sort of innovations. And of course, Starbucks, I don't know if any of you have ever done this, but to get you to prepay for your coffee, is just a silly little thing. But in fact, it was one of Starbucks' greatest hits in terms of the amount of money they got out of that. Not just in terms of cash flow, but in terms of people buying these cars up front and then losing them. So, that's radical innovation. Actually, the guy who put the wheels on the suitcase, that was a radical innovation. Anyway, plenty of examples. My point is, radical doesn't mean lots of money. And my other point is that the way that you manage this, of course, is by a process that looks a little bit like this, whereby you de-risk your ideas, as you know. And this is the world of venture capital. Well, venture capitalists have been doing this for decades. But Shell is a nice example, just because of all the companies that have tried these sort of things. This initiative they call Game Changer is continuing to go strong. Game Changer, just very briefly, this was in Shell's enormous exploration and production division. And it was a very hierarchical system, so that if you had a bright idea as a technologist, it could take you the best part of a year to get a hearing by the senior executive vice president who's responsible for it. And he or she probably didn't have the funds for you in the first place. So they said, let's cut through the hierarchy, let's create a small group of game changers who both will give you a very quick answer, and they will give you an answer, as it were, from the point of view of a middle manager rather than the point of view of a top executive. And it's a series of stage gates. There's nothing radical in that respect. But it's been very useful as a way of shortcutting the process and giving people an alternative investment path. So if my line manager doesn't like my bright idea, I can go to the guys at Game Changer. Now, as always, there's a wrinkle. The classic kind of view of 1,000 ideas yields 100 experiments, yields 10 ventures, yields one or two actual real businesses. This idea has been out there, again, for years. Pharmaceutical companies live by it, venture capitalists live by it. What's happened is that a number of companies have decided that this is the model they want to pursue. And some of you will know some of these. It's actually a tricky game, because, of course, what they do is they say we need literally thousands of ideas. So they launch these idea schemes. But you and I can quickly imagine that many of them are complete garbage. In fact, I've been through these processes, I've seen them. Many of them are complete garbage. Many of them can and probably shouldn't be kind of cast aside immediately. But you then get this sort of secondary problem that you're actually alienating, if you like, the people whose very sort of goodwill you're building on. So I mention this because a lot of companies have struggled with how to tap into the knowledge base of their employees, whilst also sort of putting some sort of solidity behind the process. I'll just give you an example, again from my own research, looking at the word of corporate venturing. Corporate venturing meaning companies that set up a discrete entity that invests in these sort of ideas. This has been a cyclical thing. I'm sorry the language is not up to date, but since 2005 it kind of crept up steadily to 2006, 2007, 2008. What was interesting was, as we did our research in this area, into these kind of experimentation vehicles, is we saw a number of different, shall we say, species of venturing units. Very briefly, is this a venturing unit whereby the opportunity exists inside the boundaries of the company? Or is it an opportunity that exists outside the boundaries of the company? Are we kind of drawing something in from the outside, or are we nurturing something on the inside? The vertical axis is this classic distinction between exploration and exploitation. Are we trying to exploit our existing assets more effectively, or are we trying to build new assets on top of that? I mentioned Shell Game Changer already as your classic kind of exploration-oriented internal activity. It's almost like an R&D activity. The other extreme is Nokia's venture partners, where they simply created an external fund, VCs running it, venture capitalists running it, almost no link of any meaningful form to Nokia itself. Indeed, it's subsequently spun off. Ecosystem venturing is where you're investing in that ecosystem with a view to creating strategic benefits for yourself. And then Brightstar, British Telecom's Brightstar, was an example of a company that's just harvesting its existing ideas. So we've got these technologies, we've got these ideas, we don't know quite what to do with them, so let's put them into a sort of a halfway house and we'll try to spin them out and try to kind of commercialize them that way. So it kind of a focus, if you like, on cash generation. The interesting question from my point of view, as I did this study back in 2001, is which ones of these entities survived the longest? Which of these four boxes would actually be the one with the most longevity? And survival, by the way, in this world is everything, because quite honestly, the survival record on that is terrible. Well, we found the following distribution of such units when we did the study back in 2001, and then we went back 2 years later, and this is what we discovered. And these are small numbers, so statistically speaking, you can't attach a great deal of significance to them. But I would draw you to the bottom two. Of the innovation venturing units, Shell Game Changer is one of the three. Only 3 of 8 survived. The ecosystem venturing units, again, a higher mortality rate. What does this statistic tell you? What it tells you is that these two latter categories, these are the exploration-oriented units. Okay? So the punchline is on the bottom. It is much harder, if you like, to tap into new ideas, to create these experimentation units with a view to actually creating something new, than if what you're trying to do is actually leverage existing assets and sell your ventures, if you like, to outsiders. So again, that's sort of the fragility, if you like, of innovation inside companies. It comes out loud and clear in this study. Okay. So, I think this is my final point on the third story, which is that there are ways of doing experimentation in companies. I think this summarizes what I've said. The point I just draw your attention to here is the word experiment is almost sort of anathema to most companies. Experiment sounds as though you don't know what you're doing. We're trying something out, and we actually don't know if it's going to succeed or fail. When I've been talking to companies about this, I always try to wrap up experiment as a pilot or as a prototype, because the word pilot says we're kind of 90% of the way down, we're not quite sure, we're just working out a few bugs. I would actually say, look, the word experiment is exactly right. An experiment says we have a hypothesis, we don't know what the outcome is going to be, let's try something, let's be confident about saying that if it fails, pat on the back, we did the right thing, we didn't put a lot of money into it. So it's a very practical lesson, but I think it's an important one, because it goes right back to this question about how much money we put into our innovation activities in the first place. Okay, so that's my kind of part one, which is all about the various, if you like, lessons for innovating in the downturn. My part two, if you like, takes me back to my own personal heartland as a researcher, which is kind of the foreign-owned sector, the sort of foreign-owned subsidiary companies in a country like Ireland, or Canada, or Sweden, or Australia, and the other places I spent a bit of time. You know about this stuff. Let me just touch on a couple of these points briefly. There's some massive challenges facing foreign subsidiaries. The transient investment challenge, this fear that somehow we are convenient as a place to do this work, as long as our labour costs are low and our tax rates are low, and as soon as You know? As soon as those change, the multinational is going to ship us off somewhere else. Closely related to that is the branch plant syndrome. Less of an issue in Ireland, but much more of one in say, Canada, where Canada used to have a whole bunch of its own indigenous multinationals, all of which have gradually been bought up or dismembered and sold off. And when an American company buys a Canadian company, the Canadian company is left thinking, what have I got left? I've just got a regional sales office. So there's an enormous paranoia in certain parts of the world about the so-called branch plant syndrome. Tyranny of distance, again, works in some countries and not in others. Certainly when you go down to Australia, this is the biggest thing that they worry about. Tyranny of distance meaning we're so far away, how can we possibly be heard? I'll just flick to the next slide. This is I changed the name of the country. Nobody wakes up in head office today thinking about what they can do in Ireland or Australia or Canada or whatever it is. This is the tyranny of distance. And of course, there is a way of turning that around. There's that famous Chinese proverb, the emperor is far away and the hills are high. In other words, we can do what the hell we like because, they can't actually get to us. There is some way of turning distance to your advantage. Indeed, some subsidiary companies in some countries, Ireland amongst them, have actually been very good at doing that. I'll just flick back. And then finally, the changing corporate structures. Corporate structures are not what they used to be. And to get your head around the way that multinationals are rethinking the way that they're structured on a global basis has an enormous bearing on the impact of foreign subsidiaries in a country like Ireland. Competition changes, and this is now quite well established, but I think 10, 15 years ago it wasn't. We've got a sort of a five forces type analysis we can do of our subsidiaries, whereby we're not just looking at competition from the external marketplace, we're looking at competition from other subsidiaries that are already selling the same things as us internally, as well as the new locations. And I've spent a lot of time in the Scottish subsidiary companies, and they would tell me that these are the 10 plants that have been identified in this country, across the world, that can do what we are doing, and they're ranking them on 25 parameters, and their job is to make sure that they end up in the top 3 or 4. It's a very, very kind of mechanical process at some level. And this is just one bit of lesson from the last crisis. The last downturn rather. Some of you will know this story. But, Motorola was among the biggest employers in Scotland, perhaps the biggest. I think IBM maybe have been bigger in the private sector. They had 4 plants. What happened to those plants? Well, 3 of them, 2 were closed down, 1 was mothballed. The only one that survived was the one which, of course, had done the best job of investing in human capital and upgrading. Now, I appreciate this is me telling sort of stat stories to you that you probably already know, but it's such an important point that it's worth reminding ourselves of what it is that separates the winners and the losers with this sort of downturn. As we look at the changing corporate structures, one thing that's very interesting that's caught my eye in the last couple of years, we used to think of a sort of a spectrum whereby the country manager, the individual who runs the operation, from a sort of autonomous leader on the left-hand side through to a legal representative on the right-hand side. The big trend over the 80s, 90s was towards the right, towards gradually cutting out the role of the country manager and focusing instead on the branch manager and having a direct connection to the various different parts of the multinational wherever they were. What we've seen of late, and I say of late, I mean gradually over the last 8 or 10 years, has been a little bit of a backlash against that. Just a couple of examples. IBM has now moved back to a more regional structure, whereby IBM in Asia is almost independent of IBM in the Western economies. Mars, Masterfield, the company that makes the Mars bars, they've created sub-regional entities so that the continental European, the Central Eastern European part of Mars is a freestanding entity. This goes from kind of Finland down to Greece. They have their own R&D department. They have their own rights to create products within those countries. And as a result, they therefore have proper country managers again. Mars went all the way to globalization at one time, and now they're saying, actually, we went too far. So, it varies from company to company. And it is also fascinating to see the nature of the connections between subsidiaries within a country. So in some of the companies that you know better than I do, the Microsofts and the Intels, what is the quality of the relationships between the plants and the operations within Ireland? I actually believe that the idea that there's a sort of a group within a country has potential as a sort of an interesting research area in the future, because up until now, most of us academics have kind of abstracted from the concept of subsidiary down to say the subsidiary is the value-adding entity in the country. And the fact that there might be another subsidiary somewhere else in the country is irrelevant. Actually, potentially, these entities can feed off one another. Okay. What hat should the country manager wear, given that these trends that we're talking about? This is borrowed from a friend of mine, Chris Bartlett, at Harvard Business School. He says there are 4 hats. There's the pioneer, there is the trader, there is the intelligence gatherer, and there's the quarterback. And of course, you recognize all of these. And there's kind of a sort of a hierarchy here. The first 2 are the most important when you're first establishing a subsidiary. Increasingly, it's actually the quarterback who's the critical player here. You may not over the years. This is an idealized scenario. I don't think Ed thinks for a second that every subsidiary can or should go through this process. But it represents sort of the aspiration that you don't get stuck in a mandate which is lower end screwdriver plant, but we aspire to various higher order positions. I could identify various examples. I'm not going to go through these specific ones. You probably know your own cases. My point is that the place you end up is not, you shouldn't, in some ways, is a function of many circumstances. It's a function of your initiative as a country manager. It's a function of the circumstances in which you find yourself in your country, in your company. It's a function of the local environment. And while we can look at the NCR Scotlands of this world and say that's where we want to be, realistically we know that many such subsidiaries will never come to pass, and indeed many also sort of move backwards down this list. And indeed you can even think of a very, very narrow slice. Just a brief example, you all know the New Beetle. Well, the origins of the New Beetle itself came out of 2 guys in Volkswagen in California. They had this bright idea. They said, the Beetle had this beautiful heritage in the US. Volkswagen has kind of gone to the dogs, at least in North America it has. How can we kind of revitalize it? Well, everyone remembers the Beetle. So let's propose a new Beetle. They managed to find a few people to support this idea. They actually did a bit of design work on it in California. But of course, once the thing happened, it all went back to Germany, as you would expect from a company like Volkswagen. That's not, my point is that this was a major win for the American Volkswagen. And I knew those folks pretty well for a time. I mean, for them, it didn't matter that they didn't get the value-added activities in America. The fact is, they were the people who came up with the idea. They helped to shape it. And of course, it sold very well. I mean, Volkswagen's had this real up and down ride in the US. It's back down in the dumps now, but following the New Beetle, they had quite a resurgence. So I want to just dig into one research paper, a recent research paper that I wrote, looking at the subsidiary from the point of view of kind of an attention perspective. This is the last real segment in my talk, and it's the paper I'm going to go into in, I think, the greatest depth. You know what I mean by attention? Attention is the extent to which head office invests time in understanding what the subsidiary is doing. And immediately you can realize that attention can be negative and positive. I mean, attention can be on our backs all the time because they don't trust us. Attention can also be, we love what you're doing, tell us more. Attention is a market. There is demand for attention and there is supply of attention. The demand for attention, when I say attention now, I mean the attention of the head office, the chief executive and his or her team at a distant headquarters. There's lots of things catching their eye. And of course, there's only highly constrained availability of that team's time. It doesn't matter how good the technology is, that only impinges to some degree on constraints in our person's time. So as I started thinking about what it is that makes some subsidiaries effective at influencing head office, it became apparent to me that the attention that is granted to the subsidiary is an important variable. I just want to help you think through what I mean by that. The first way to get your head around it is the attention structures, the mechanisms by which attention is achieved, the attention channels. And some of this, of course, is PR people. Some of this is the stuff that the chief executive reads. Some of it comes through the formal reports that he or she receives. Lots of different forums for attention. And the important question that you need to get your head around as a country manager in Ireland, let's say, is which are the channels that matter to our distant head office, and which ones can we therefore influence? So think of this in terms of the following matrix. If the vertical side is to do with what you might call the bottom-up attention structures, this is the reports that the chief executive gets on every country in his or her subsidiary, his or her company. The horizontal axis is the attention to a country on the basis of external cues, by which I mean the stuff they read in the newspapers, the stuff they hear on the radio, the stuff that is told to them by various external parties. We have, major markets and low attention markets. Typically, the major markets, the US, the Japans, the Germanys, the big countries. The interesting ones are the off-diagonals. The honeypots, China. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that China finds its way there. Every executive in the world nowadays knows what his company's strategy on China is because everyone keeps asking them. And when I was doing some interviews down in Asia, the guy in Australia said, my Chinese counterpart gets visits every week. Every week there's another party from head office trying to figure out what's happening in China. He said, I don't know how he gets any work done because, he spends all his time entertaining visitors. So honeypots get attention, although it may not be the sort of attention you really want. The interesting one is the top left, right? The squeaky wheels that get the grease. That is to say, these are countries that on any absolute traditional measures might not be deemed to be that important. Ireland might well find something in that category, as does Australia or Canada. Are they still entities whereby attention is given to them because of what they do? And that's the kind of the place you want to be, I would argue. I'll give you a bit of data to show how you get there. We made this distinction in this research study. Cyril Bouquet is a colleague of mine, where we distinguish between essentially weight and voice. And what we said was, look, every subsidiary has a certain weight, measured in terms of the strategic significance of its markets. Okay, so this is the horizontal axis on my matrix. The strength of the subsidiary, the current strength of the subsidiary within its node. But as we know, you can punch above your weight and you can punch below your weight. What is it that allows you to punch above your weight? Well, it's your voice. And your voice is a combination of what I've in the past called initiative taking. Initiative taking is proactively going after opportunities, whereas profile building is about hanging out in head office, talking up what you're doing, essentially. And you can argue that these are complementary activities. Profile building is about networking and getting yourself known. Initiative taking is the actual action that flows from that allows you to have a story to tell. As we studied the performance of subsidiaries in terms of the attention that they received, and we measured attention both in terms of how often mentioned in the annual report as well as a questionnaire-based measure, we discovered that something like 20% of the variance in attention was explained by weight factors, and about 8% of the variance was explained by voice factors. So they both mattered. Weight, not surprisingly, has more weight, is more important, but voice matters as well. And interestingly, it was particularly the subsidiaries that were further away where the kind of voice mattered. In other words, the further you are away, the harder you have to work to sell yourself. That's not a surprise. And also particularly in cases where they have what you might call strong local competence that enable them to have a story to tell. So, I don't know if this has crossed your mind, but attention all sounds okay. But attention has this sort of negative connotation as well. What would be really nice to have would be both attention and autonomy. That is to say, I wouldn't mind being, attended to, listened to by head office, whilst also having the freedom to act. Well, what the scatter plot from this research showed us, of course, is that in fact it's actually quite possible to be both. There were a significant number of the subsidiaries in our sample actually were both high on attention as well as high on autonomy. And this is the real sort of killer statistic. Look at that correlation. If you like correlations, 0.54 is a strong correlation in anyone's book. What the correlation shows is autonomy multiplied by attention on the vertical axis, initiative taking on the horizontal axis. So, Which one leads to which? Well, that's for you to decide. But the point is that the initiative-taking subsidiaries were the ones who also had managed to get this nice sort of coexistence between high levels of autonomy as well as high levels of tension. I can make a fairly compelling case that A leads to B and that B leads to A. So, let me pull it together and then I will close and we can open it up for questions. I think it's important to kind of remind ourselves that subsidiary strategy, all along my point of view has been subsidiary strategy is built on entrepreneurial subsidiary managers, subsidiary managers who are prepared to look beyond what they're currently doing and challenge the status quo. I think in terms of another matrix between opportunity and capability, a little company, I'm calling them Pascal, I've changed the name to protect the guilty. This was a UK subsidiary of a German multinational, and it was a chemical company, a plastics company. And I asked the general manager in the UK about new ideas. Surely you should be going after opportunities to add value, to come up with new products, new opportunities, blah, blah, blah. And he said, no, we don't do that, because if there are any good ideas, the guys in head office would already have thought about them. So, and this was way early on in my doctoral studies. At that point I thought, oh, that's very strange. But now I look back and I think, my gosh, what had the head office done to this guy to convince him that he had no good ideas? Because obviously at some point he did, and they were bashed down so thoroughly that he decided he didn't want to raise his head above the parapet. So, there's a real sense of missed opportunities in some subsidiaries. You can find yourself in the other place, whereby you kind of push yourself too far. And just one example from Monsanto. I mean, this is a few years back, but they made this bid for a big $100 million opportunity when it was just a tiny subsidiary. And the American parent company just said, look, we love you, we love your proposal, but frankly, it's not going to happen in Canada. It's going to happen somewhere, within the 50 states, if you like. So anyway, they kind of licked their wounds and they retrenched, and they gradually adopted a much safer strategy, a series of much smaller incremental steps along the lines of the big stepping staircase that I showed you earlier. So, finally, the quarterback. I mentioned the quarterback before. Let me just finish with the quarterback. What does he or she really do? I think they do three things. They're networkers, they're entrepreneurs, they're going out, they're raising the profile of the business, they're oiling the wheels. The guys in PepsiCo Australia said, our policy every year is in our three best managers somewhere else in the Pepsi world, to America, to Europe, wherever it is. And of course, on one hand that's giving away your talent, on the other hand he's actually seeing the rest of the company with the great Australian promising people. And of course now PepsiCo, if you go to look at them, is actually filled with Australians, it turns out. So guess what? The Australian subsidiary is actually in a very good place because he had a policy of giving away his talent. They're catalysts for change. They're aggressive and career-seeking types, so they cannot hide for long. And now getting inside the personality of these people. But essentially the subsidiary managers who really make a difference, of course, are the ones that cannot live with the status quo. And then finally, they are advocates and defenders of their country operation. And you could read it. My loyalty is to the region of the company, region first and company second. And some people might find that odd, and some people in head office definitely find that odd, but in fact, in my experience, they're often the most successful country managers, and for reasons that I think you can read. So I'm going to stop there, actually, in the interest of giving us time for questions and answers. Let me just make one observation before I close, which is, I want to sort of finish where I started. I talked about the quarterback. The quarterback is the catalyst, the entrepreneur, who seeds the ideas and the opportunities that can then be sold to the parent company that ultimately lead to that rating and success of the enterprise if it's a foreign-owned company. And of course, if you think about it, that is that's kind of the essence of what makes for a successful economy. I define entrepreneurship as the pursuit of opportunities without regard for the resources you control. It's not my definition. That's Howard Stevenson at Harvard's definition. The pursuit of opportunity without regard for the resources you control. If you think about it, this applies to an individual entrepreneur, This could be Richard Branson, for example, but it also applies to a corporate person. Because the corporate person who says, I can only act within the confines of my own kind of span of control, my own people, is only ever going to do incremental things. The corporate entrepreneur is the person who says, this has got to happen, and I've got to mobilize resources across the organization. So, for me, enterprise and entrepreneurship is the heart of an innovation strategy. Everything else matters, but the heart of it is that kind of behavioural predisposition towards initiative taking. So I will stop there. Thank you very much.